Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos, and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, join the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of Passive House Podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How's it going, Zach?
It's good. It's good. How are you, Matthew?
I'm pretty good. Although I did hear that a couple of weeks ago we achieved a new record.
Yes, and not a very happy one.
Not a very good one. The record was we hit the 420 parts per million of CO2 in our atmosphere. I see 421, which is an up nearly 5 parts per million from the previous record of just 12 months prior to that. So as I was listening to your chat on my run, I was contributing to some of that CO2 myself, but I was thinking about who's responsible. Who do we blame for all of that? You got any thoughts on that?
That's a big question. Well, we're all certainly implicated in all of it. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But there are big systems at play, and I think that part of what's great about the conversation today that we're going to share is that buildings are, one of those kind of big, huge industries and systems. And we have the power to make a really big difference in this area.
Yeah.
And policy can make a big impact.
That pretty much is the outtake and what I was thinking, that it kind of doesn't matter who is responsible and what's responsible for that, apart from understanding what continues to contribute to it. But what we need to do is think about what collectively we are going to do and how we can contribute to improving that. And you're right. This conversation is, and like all other conversations we're having that are shifting more and more towards climate and energy consumption, that they are part of the solution. One of the words that kept popping up in this interview to shift from a bit of a negative start was excitement. I challenge you to count the number of words that the word excitement comes up in this interview.
Yeah.
But hey, before we get into the interview, we've got a few people to thank for bringing us the Passive House podcast.
We do. Yes. Everything that we do at the Passive House Accelerator is thanks to support from our sponsors. And none of this would happen without them. So a big shout out to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minotaur All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And our stakeholder partner is NYPH. So thank you to all of those supporters.
Awesome. Now we'll jump into this week's interview with Tom from New York. He's at New York City at the moment.
That's right. Yep.
But just before we do that, there's a couple of numbers in here and a bit of terminology. We're talking about Law 97, which Tom and yourself explained, but it applies to buildings that are 25,000 square feet. which for those of us outside of America, that's 2,300 meters. So we're talking square meters. So we're talking relative, medium to large buildings, but not an insignificant number of the building stock. So it's around just over 2,000 square meters. We also, towards the end, talk about, I love BTUs. It always cracks me up that America uses British thermal units.
But anyway, rub it in. Thank you.
58.1 killer BTUs per square foot. It happens to be a nice round figure of 121 kilowatt hours per square meter. And we might put a few links up at the show notes where you can find some of those, not necessarily, well, maybe the conversions, but also some of those numbers as they relate to the various levels of passive house requirements. So that one there, 58.1 kilo
38, BTUs. 38.1. Yep.
And 38.1 kilo BTUs per square foot is 120 kilowatt hours per square meter. All right, that's our maths lesson for today. Back to you, Zach.
All right. Well, I'm really happy to be able to share this interview with Tom Eisele. Tom is the founder of Eisele Architects. He's which is a design and consulting firm in New York City. He's an urban planner, a licensed architect. He's a lead AP, certified passive house designer, a member of AIA and the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. He has nearly 40 years of professional experience on building and planning projects around the world. He also serves as the policy advisor for New York Passive House, and he's been helping me and others at the Accelerator quite a bit recently to plan and produce the Passive House Policy Summit, which will be on April 26th. From 2010 to 2019, Tom was the senior policy advisor in the New York City Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability and the Mayor's Office of Resiliency. And he was drafting local laws, amending the city's construction codes, zoning resolutions, and environmental regulations. He himself has acted as a principal drafter of over 60 local laws. So he has a really deep knowledge around local laws and policymaking. And he's been working to develop methodologies for tracking building energy consumption and establish metrics for that purpose, including the targets for mandated greenhouse gas emission caps that we'll be talking about for buildings as part of the city's Climate Mobilization Act, and specifically Local Law 97. So it is there's a lot of wonkiness in this conversation, but also a lot of excitement, as you say, because it is one of the shining examples of what policy can do to really transform and accelerate the transition to passive house building. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you about policy, about Local Law 97, what's going on in New York. It's also been a lot of fun to collaborate with you on this upcoming policy summit that we have coming up on Monday, April 26th. And I know we'll be touching on some of the themes there. So welcome to the Passive House Podcast.
Thanks, Zach. It's great to be talking to you today. So I'll give you a little introduction to myself. My name is Tom Eisele. I'm an architect and urban planner by background. Mostly designing buildings in New York City, although I've designed projects all over the world. Everything from like skyscrapers to kitchens. So I've kind of been around the block. And through my planning side, worked a lot with New York City zoning on a number of large-scale projects in the city. And about 10 years ago, I started as a volunteer, and then that evolved into a staff position with the New York City Mayor's Office of what was long-term planning and sustainability during the Bloomberg administration, and then evolved to the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, and post-Hurricane Sandy, a secondary office called the Office of Resiliency. And I kind of straddled those two offices, working mainly on urban policy, around zoning and the construction codes, air quality and environmental issues, Did a lot of sandy recovery work and bolstering the city building code around flood resilience and energy efficiency. Worked with NYSERDA on the latest iteration of the New York Stretch Energy Code, and then tweaking that with some of my friends at New York Passive House to craft it into becoming New York City's current energy code, and at least and I was working on the residential side of that. Left the mayor's office at the end of 2019. Kind of hung my architect shingle out again. I am also a certified passive house designer, and have been asked to be the policy advisor now for New York Passive House. So that's a little bit of my journey.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And it makes sense that you would be tapped for doing that role with New York Passive House, given that you've had your fingers in so many elements of policy over the last decade. So
yeah, I might also mention that I've been listening to Mike Ingui talk about even what was before Passive House Accelerator was what he always called the playbook. Mm-hmm. And he and I have been discussing the playbook, now, for like 8 or 9 years. And I watched that evolve, and we tried to figure, discussions about where that would reside and who wanted to have it and who would own it, or but he always bristled at ownership because he just wants everybody to have this information. Yeah. And then he started talking to me about this thing that he and his wife Diane were kind of noodling about on their dining table. And he was so excited about it, and that's what has become the Passive House Accelerator.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very fun. It's just totally great.
It's a great vision, Michael's. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, so let's dive into Local Law 97, which is really groundbreaking legislation. Super interesting. Can you give listeners an introductory to the local law and why it matters for climate, as well as what implications it has for Passive House in New York City and potentially, much broader?
Sure. So Local Law 97 is a New York City local law that requires buildings to report their greenhouse gas emissions. And what is already in place, what has been in place, is something called benchmarking, which is a local law in New York City requiring buildings over 25,000 square feet to report their energy consumption on an annual basis. Their electricity use, natural gas, and fuel oil consumption. And then after that, every building within that portfolio of size has to report that to the city. Local Law 97 is a kind of add-on to that, whereby with this greenhouse gas emission, or this energy use consumption, there is a conversion factor that takes place that converts those therms and kilowatt hours and gallons of fuel oil into greenhouse gas emissions equivalent, metric tons of carbon equivalent, and of CO2 and other gases. And that gets reported, and that will get reported starting in the year 2024 to the city. And in 2024, there is a first deadline, if you will, or reporting point, where these greenhouse gas emissions have to be reported, and each building, depending on its typology, is given a limit. So now every building over a certain size in the city has a greenhouse gas emissions budget, and buildings are required to report that on an annual basis. And for every year after 2024, every year that the building exceeds that budget, there will be a fine imposed.
Yeah.
Right. So it's rather than sort of hit it piecemeal and say, look at energy efficiency and specific measures, the law itself is actually agnostic as to how one achieves that. But you have to achieve it. You're just given, as Chris Benedict used to say, it's the perfect energy code. Here's your number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We don't care how you do it. Meet the number. And it's just, it makes me smile that this has in fact now become
Yeah,
come to truth.
it is pretty remarkable. So just to back up a moment on a couple of the points you just raised on the benchmarking. I'm right in saying that for those buildings that are 25,000 square feet or larger, you walk into them now and you can see a letter grade.
Yes, that's another local law, and I'm blanking on the local number, but yes, as part of this Climate Mobilization Act, which is a package of local laws that the city of New York passed in 2019. Local Law 97 is the greenhouse gas emissions limit. You're required to post a sign in your building lobby, which is similar to a letter grade with a letter grade on it, which is similar to what the health department has used for many years for food service establishments. And that letter grade is based on an Energy Star score. So now all of the same group of buildings in New York City have to have an Energy Star score and post that letter. And then there are tiers based on that Energy Star score giving you a letter grade, and that has to be posted in every building.
Yeah, which just seems like such a powerful tool in terms of raising awareness for people about energy performance in buildings.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something that people typically think about. So probably that, I imagine that is a good precursor to the past. Well, I guess I don't know how the chronology worked, but it's certainly a good foundation for support of things like Local Law 97, I would imagine. The other question I had was, and a lot of listeners are probably aware of this, but for big cities like New York, buildings are a huge portion of greenhouse, or account for a huge portion of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly where the energy system is still dirty. What is it? 80%, 70%?
Well, no, it's less than that. So it's the percentage has shifted as over the last few years. It's between 67 and 70% of New York City's GHG footprint or carbon footprint is from buildings, is from building emissions.
Yeah.
For an urban center, for a dense urban center like New York City, unlike other places in the country or North America, it's where transportation tends to be a larger portion. New York City has over a million buildings that already exist, and many that are in design and being constructed right now. So buildings account for the majority of our emissions right now.
Right. So I'm sorry, I interrupted your flow a little bit.
Okay.
So you were just talking about how satisfying it is to be at this place where we truly are, give me the number. That's, going back to Chris Benedict.
Mm-hmm. It's incredibly exciting. I mean, this is, I keep saying paradigm shift. And I truly believe it, that, and I'm sorry, kind of repeating myself, but up until now, in most places for designers and builders, we have our regulations and our codes have said, make a promise. Design, here are your design criteria. Here's what you have to show in the design that the building is going to do, how it will behave. And if you demonstrate that to a plans examiner, to their satisfaction, you get a building permit. We've been not so great in terms of enforcement of that promise. And this is the paradigm shift for me, is that we are shifting from a design promise that we've been not so great on following up and checking that the building is actually doing that, to measuring what the building is in fact doing and holding building owners accountable for that.
And
so it's exciting. It's truly exciting. Now what it also says is that it lays out for, those are the targets. And let me just sort of one step farther. There are the metrics that the law lays out. There's one coefficient, or there's one budget. There are targets per square foot that go into effect in 2024 and are in place until 2029. In 2030, the screws get tightened, and that target of emissions per square foot goes down, diminishes. And that's in place for another 10 years. And then the screws get tightened again out to 2050, where for all intents and purposes, the expectation of the law is that we'll be at net zero. So for a lot of buildings, they're in New York City, they're kind of, unless they're just really poorly operated, or they have some special circumstances, like a data center or some enormous energy use. A fair portion of existing buildings in the city are okay for their first reporting phase.
Mm-hmm.
It's not de minimis, but the bar is set at such a place that most buildings can meet it. When we get out to 2030 and the bar gets, raised or lower depending on the metaphor, when that budget gets tightened down, at that point, and really way before that, a lot of buildings are going to have to do something. Now, so that's for existing buildings. For new buildings, it becomes a discussion between designers and clients about what you're going to design to. Are you designing to current code? In which case you're going to have to be, it almost behooves the designers to say, if we do this, you'll meet code and you'll meet current code and you'll get your permit, but you're going to have to go back and do some retrofit at some point in the future. So do you want to spend money, and depending on who you discuss this with, it could be a small amount of money or par, or do you postpone that and spend a significant amount of money out at some point in the future to retrofit your building in order to, stay in compliance with Local Law 97?
Yeah. I have a couple of questions. One is about performance and the other is about predictability. So I guess the first one is just, if you do passive house, how does that stack up against these different tightenings of the screws, as you mentioned?
Well, the first thing about passive house is they're passive measures. So you're not, except for ventilation, you're not relying on any kind of power, fossil fuel, renewable, or otherwise, for the maintaining of the interior comfort of the building. I mean, passive house does rely on electricity for it's for ventilation, right? We've got mechanical ventilation, energy recovery ventilation, but that still requires power. But other than that, and then cooking and and illumination, which require electricity, passive house measures are exclusive of any kind of power requirement. So philosophically and technically, you're way ahead of the game taking a passive house design approach because you're not dependent on any kind of mechanical system for maintaining the comfort of the building.
Right. Now, on the predictability side, there's lots of folks have spoken about the performance gap for green buildings, right?
Yeah.
And the lack of correlation between the promise and the delivery of the building.
Right.
And you mentioned that this is the big paradigm shift for Local Law 97. Does that open up a special opportunity for passive house here?
Well, I think it does, in that, to be kind of simple about it, from a construction perspective, good enough is not good enough anymore. The performance is dependent on the quality of the construction. The design, for sure. You have to design a building correctly to and get the intended performance out of it. You've got to have that to go at. But the quality of the construction, the coordination of systems, the understanding of the constructors of what is intended, of the intended outcome, and buy-in from the construction side of that team of owner, designer, and constructor there has to be an equal understanding of the intended outcome and a unity of intention to that. So yes, the opportunity there is actually it's manifold. There's an education component. We're all looking to expand our knowledge base and our understanding and our intellectual and emotional buy-in to this as our trajectory, for us in the AE, in the architecture, engineering, and construction industries. So that knowledge base, that level of understanding of what the desired and required outcomes are, needs to be broadened. We have to have a workforce that is broad enough and consistent enough to be able to handle the marketplace. And this marketplace is growing. I think at the moment it's getting to the place where the train is like taken off at such a velocity that we're going to have challenges to keep up. So yeah, it's an awesome time to be in this space. There are lots of opportunities to share the knowledge, to gain the knowledge, and make really good work happen. I think that's, it's exciting. It really is.
Yeah, no, it is. I remember when I was first introduced to Passive House, 10 years ago, there were very few projects. There were these little single family projects that were happening around. And I think sometimes we still bemoan, we think nobody knows about Passive House and have this sense, I think, that we're on the fringe, but you have a different perspective about that. Can you share that?
Oh, you mean like this? I can remember. Well, one thing that pops into my head is like when I was in the mayor's office, and there was a guy named David Yaskol, who was another volunteer at the same time I was, and this is also about 10 years ago. I remember him coming up to me and saying, "You're an architect." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why aren't you doing Passive House?"
That's awesome.
And in my own mind, and so this is about 10 years ago. And in my own mind, it didn't answer him out loud, but I'm thinking to myself, oh, that's just so fringy. I don't know if that's what you were thinking of, Zach, but what prompt me a little better, because that's just what popped into my head.
I guess I've heard you talk about just the idea that we're past that point. We're in a different reality now, where it's
That's right.
Yeah.
It's the train, it's the train is going fast enough. And I remember the first time I went to a North American Passive House Network conference, and it was like, Jesus, Passive House is such great stuff. We need to tell somebody. And the next year it was, we got to tell some more people about this. And then the third year I attended, it was like, how do we scale this up? How do we make this bigger? And by the fourth year, we're all looking at each other going, God, it's making it into the law. How are we going to keep up?
Right.
It's just, the train is well on the way. And as Local Law 97 demonstrates, and New York City also has for its own portfolio, there's Local Law 31 of what year was that? 17. Requires buildings, and this is for the city's own portfolio, to meet either three thresholds: 50% better than the average of the benchmark data for buildings of that typology, which is on city record; 50% better than an ASHRAE 90.1 Appendix D model building, or 36 kBTU per square foot per year for new buildings, or 42 for retrofits. And those of us in this community know those are those markers, those are those metrics of Passive House performance.
Yeah.
Now, I have to raise my hand and admit guilt that those numbers made it into that local law because I put them there.
Right.
Or actually, it was a city council staff person's lawyer that said, well, what's passive, as we're trying to figure out these metrics for this local law 31, I said, well, what's passive house? And I told him, and the next draft that came back to me to look at had those numbers in there. And I went, oh, I think some people are going to be laughing. But it's getting codified.
Yeah.
It is this level of performance has been making its way into all kinds of code language, not just in New York City, in Massachusetts, on the West Coast, in Canada. So North America is catching on collectively at an accelerating pace to passive house requirements, to passive house and passive house level performance. And with like Local Law 97 as an example, we're also moving beyond the design promise to measurable, quantifiable, provable, ongoing performance of our buildings.
Yeah, and I think that going back to the performance gap, particularly on thermal energy performance, passive house does a really good job of correlating of predicting what the actual performance will be.
Yeah,
which I think is fairly unique among green building tools. So it does seem like a really natural fit there. You mentioned code progress and of course Local Law 97, and then we had a conversation just recently with Beverly Craig from Massachusetts Clean Energy Center on the podcast, and she's going to be part of the summit. And she was talking about incentives and subsidies. These we just were talking about the three-legged stool of policy, as you coined, and the ways that those can be mutually reinforcing as well. The cap, the raising the floor with code, and incentivizing change through subsidies. So,
and I think those go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say that I just wanted to just point out that listeners who want to learn more about how all those interact and also see really great examples that could be replicated elsewhere, please join us for the summit on April 26th.
And in the discussion about thinking about organizing this summit, we need, we're all advocates. We all got to get out and bring our ideas, bring our experiences, our best practices, our trials and tribulations as well, because all policy is dynamic, right? And in a way, unfortunately, most of the time policy is reactive, right? Code changes happen as a result of something that happened. Post 9/11, we all got more serious about security and structural stability and a number of issues. Hurricanes tend to sensitize us to risks, climate risks, and our vulnerabilities in the environment. At a time when things are sort of okay, it's hard for us who are, interested in making changes to get anybody, worked up about that to making change. So we still have to have voices, loud voices. We need leadership. There are tons of opportunity to fix things that you think are not working so well, or push for policy evolution that can get us farther down the road. And the three-legged stool is an integral thing. I mean, we talked about metaphors and we talked about Venn diagrams also, that those three things overlap. It's hard for a lot of our communities to effectuate change without support, policy support and, fiscal financial support. So that's both a motivator and a sustainer. There are certain sectors that will only do what they're told they have to do, and that's where codes come into play, right? And then there are some of us who are always more aspirational, and we leave that to those folks to push the envelope. I have to constantly remind myself, as somebody who was a policymaker and a code maker for a while, that codes are about raising the floor, not pushing the envelope necessarily. Right. And all of those things can work together, and they have to, actually. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We can't really make policy, before we have confidence that the support for that policy will be there.
Right. And that we have the means to deliver. In the field. So a little bit back to Local Law 97, anyone who has been involved in policy advocacy around buildings will know, and probably most people will intuit anyway, that doing something like Local Law 97 that's a big lift. That's a big deal to require building owners to improve their buildings and to have penalties for it when they don't. And I mean, from my perspective, it's necessary. I mean, we need to bring the energy consumption and the carbon emissions of our buildings down, and so we've got to do it.
Yep. So.
And I'm sure it's politically fraught in some ways. So given that, do you see what lessons can other jurisdictions take from Local Law 97, and do you think that other jurisdictions should emulate it?
Well, it is a bit stunning, to be frank, that Local Law 97 got passed.
Yeah.
This is an enormous leap as a policy provision, and I can remember talking to there have been times when I've been talking to students of environmental policy, and it was kind of charming to see in their faces that they assume that when somebody writes a law, when a jurisdiction like New York City or New York State or our federal government passes a law, there's an assumption that means that everything's been figured out, and as soon as the bell rings and the gates are open, that everything is in place to make it happen. And the stunned looks on students' faces when I say, there are times when laws are actually aspirational, and in government, those that are the legislators, a New York City Council or a state assembly or Senate, or our federal legislative branch, those entities are in the business of making laws. They're not necessarily in the business of enforcing those laws or managing those programs. So there are times, and here's sort of a dropping the veil for a second, that all the details aren't necessarily fully worked out. So this is the bit of it's not quite a leap of faith. There's a lot that's been figured out already around Local Law 97, and lots of thought and analysis that went into assessing its feasibility. So it's feasible. It's doable. There are administrative things that are still kind of in the works around rules and where are there exceptions that are reasonable and should be granted and so forth. So it's a bold move. A lot of places don't. It's a challenge. Not every place has the political will to do that. And there are also times when it is not really appropriate to take such a broad leap. And I think that, frankly, a lot of the world is looking at New York City to watch to see how well this goes.
Yeah.
Although, to be frank, though, it's a matter of, if one looks at one's history, it wasn't too long. It was within our own lifetimes when we thought going to double glazed windows was the nuttiest thing anybody ever thought to propose, and large swaths of the design and construction communities were like, that's just going to fall out. Right. So we evolved, and we have to get out of our comfort zone for a bit, usually, to make progress. This Local Law 97, to be frank, is a stretch, but it's doable. And it's not as hard as anybody imagines. The same way, Passive House had cost premiums attached to it when it was more of an unknown, when there was this little bit of a fear factor that translated to cost premiums because of lack of experience. And I think, like everything, as we gain experience with Local Law 97, and the mechanisms get ironed out and compliance is happening, it won't be very long before it won't even seem like an unusual thing.
Right.
So should other people do it? Should it be adopted elsewhere? I think, conceptually, yes, we should be measuring our energy consumption if we want to get to our goals of saving ourselves. And I don't I'm making that blunt point, at keeping to our promises of reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, in holding and managing climate change as best we can, then we have to have firm metrics in place and actual measurable targets to hit at, to go for, and achieve. Or how do we know where we are?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we have no idea if we're doing the right thing or we're making progress. So I think in that sense, whatever form that takes, we have to have solid, tangible, quantifiable, and certifiable targets to meet. And those should be the minimums. Those should be regulatory.
Well, it's a great model, and it is. I think you're right. There are a lot of eyes on it, and I think a lot of inspiration that other jurisdictions will draw from it. I know that there are already similar moves going on in Boston, I believe, and maybe some thinking about that in Cambridge, and and you're right. And I think that's the measurable metrics is something that really resonates, I think, with listeners of this podcast and practitioners of Passive House. It's like, let's cut through the BS and look at the numbers and figure out how to actually deliver in a meaningful way. So this has been a really great conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
It's an exciting time, although I guess all times could be considered exciting in their own way. And I guess to sort of pivot slightly, I had a wonderful conversation with a young woman who's just starting her first job as a planner. And I'm thinking, in the midst of this pandemic, and I'm from my own age point and my own perspective, what an odd time we're in. And it was delightful to hear someone who is at the beginning of her working life and has a different perspective and a different generational and otherwise from me, saying how excited she was that coming out of this pandemic and this odd climate place that we're in is the potential for another roaring 20s, another time of enthusiasm and brilliance and creativity and progress. That, because I'm like, gosh, this pandemic's running along. What's going on? We're observing more and more climate shocks all the time, and do we have the will to deal with it? And here is this enthusiastic young person who's saying it's going to be great. So we have so. From our Passive House perspective, it's greater by the day. We have our challenges in that, the train is turning into a rocket and the engine's already lit. So it's, we have a lot of work to do. And that is both a challenge and, a yelp of enthusiasm and joy.
Wonderful.
It's great. It's just great. We got lots to do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, with that, I think let's close it. This has been a really fantastic interview, Tom. Thank you very much, and
thanks,
can't wait for the summit with you.
Yeah, always fun. Just love it. Thanks.
And that was Tom Eisele there from Eisele Architects, and also a contributor to New York City's Local Law 97. Great interview, Zach.
Yeah, thank you. What did you think? What were some key takeaways for you?
Well, straight off the bat, really nice of Tom to acknowledge the work of Michael Ingui, which we talked about before. As I love that vision of Michael and his wife sitting around the kitchen table, just sketching out something that has become the Passive House Accelerator. And I definitely thank Michael and the rest of the team for doing that and creating what has become a great network of people and a really good movement. A lot of stuff in there. Big outtake. I mean, the underlying theme and the significance of Law 97, I don't think we can understate, is the fact that it's measuring the actual performance, and it sets itself apart from almost any other building code or compliance measurements in the anywhere other than maybe the likes of Energy Star. We do have a thing called Neighbours, which is in Australia, which is energy building rating scheme, where you have to actually operate a building for 12 months and then report on not just the energy consumption, but some of the metrics of the inside, like the temperature and the humidity, daylighting, and things like that. But that's very, very niche. This, to put a stake in the ground and say, this is how buildings have to perform, and we don't care how you do it. That's the significant thing. It's not a prescriptive, you must have this amount of this number of inches or millimeters of insulation on your building. They don't care about that. They just care how it's actually going to operate, and that's huge.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the clarity there of just choosing a number, as Tom was talking about, and holding buildings to it I think is really powerful, and that simplicity makes it tough. You can't. It's not something you can kind of sort of fudge around. It's the real. It's either you hit that number or you don't. And we're talking about 50,000 buildings that this will impact in New York City, with multi-million-dollar fines levied if the building owners don't meet the targets. And I think the initial targets are modest enough that it's not going to hit those buildings right away. But if these building owners don't make improvements to the existing buildings, so that they can hit the targets of 80% better than a benchmark by 2050 in terms of emissions reductions, then there will be real consequences. So I think that what is really exciting about that is that there are going to be a bunch of building owners who are looking for a solution to operational carbon emissions that provides predictable results. That they can depend on, because it really is going to impact their bottom line. And so I think that approaches like Passive House that have that kind of track record, especially on thermal energy, right? It really, really strong predictive power around thermal energy for Passive House. Those approaches will be, I think, in high demand.
Yeah, it's nice how those numbers magically line up. As we said, as we said at the outset, the 38.1 kilobituses per square foot translates to 120 kilowatt hours per square meter in the metric system. I really like what Tom said about it's an exciting time to learn, but also to share, and an exciting time to do good work. And that story of progression just over the last 10 years, where he said, someone just pointed and said, "You're an architect. Why are you not doing Passive House?" And he said it was too fringy. It was too sort of out there. And now it's like, whoa, do we have enough people? Because this train's moving fast, and we're going to have to upskill. And he's right. It is really exciting times to see this. So this is big. It's big for New York, and it has a lot of similarities to the Energy Step Code, which I know that we're also talking about in the Policy Summit, and has also been held up as a leading example around the world of that power of having a roadmap and telling industry very clearly, this is where we're going. You don't have to freak out right now about, the putting in high performance windows, but you do have to freak out between sometime between now and the next 5 years, or at least change, we're signaling this is where things are going. And that is such a powerful model. I think something I'm interested in, and possibly a lot of listeners from outside of New York, will be, how do we make this happen in other places? What's the genesis behind all this that really made it happen at this time in this place? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you mentioned the step code, which is kind of a partly, at least, an outgrowth of what was going on, has been going on in the city of Vancouver. I think that you have political leadership in both Vancouver in the form of their mayor at the time, and also in New York City, that really takes the time. I think we're that are setting ambitious goals, but takes the time to understand what that means in terms of buildings. And buildings are a huge portion of cities' emissions, as was alluded to in the conversation with Tom. And so as soon as you get serious about emissions and then spend the time to understand what that means for buildings, then you've got to be driven to energy performance, right? The real energy performance. And so I think that I mean, a lot of this, honestly, I mean, is coming from examples from elsewhere in the world, like the examples of what happened in the Brussels region. And that was a great example of a government saying incentivizing best practice in buildings, exemplary buildings as the term was, saying that and then implementing those with their own public buildings, and then saying that, hey, we're moving toward this becoming code, and then Passive House essentially becoming code in 2015. So that story, I think, was really influential for a lot of policy advocates and policymakers, and also some developers here in North America. And so there's really a direct lineage between what was going on in Brussels and I think what then ended up happening in the city of Vancouver, and probably has enabled what's been going on in New York City, which brought me to another piece of these conversations that we've been having with policymakers and policy advocates, and is that we talk about proof of concept with passive house projects all the time, right? Like how powerful it is to see a successful multifamily building built to passive house, because then you can point to it, you can show that it wasn't crazy expensive, and that it works, and that the residents are happy, and all that stuff. So it's proof that it all works. The same is true for policy, and so we can borrow these ideas, and yes, some of the details will be different in different jurisdictions or in different countries, but the basic kind of design of an emissions cap, or raising the floor through code, or figuring out how to incentivize effectively with carrots. All those things I think have somewhat universal applicability. So, and it's already, the point is it's already happened toward North America. So maybe North America can give back a little bit with some examples,
Absolutely. And I've encouraged and pointed people towards the Energy Step Code, as have others. I know a lot as a shining light, and I think this Law 97 will be similar and say, hey, look, if they can do this in New York, we can do it anywhere. Tom said at one point that policy is not there to raise the floor. It's there to raise the floor, not to push the envelope.
Code. And I think code. Yes. Code.
Yep. Sorry. That's a really good point. Code is there to raise the floor, not to push the envelope. And I think that is an important distinction right there between code and policy. This type of policy, this type of statement does push the envelope. It certainly will for a lot of people, maybe not for us who are already sort of in the passive house tent and
right.
knowing, we know that the stuff is achievable, but for the mainstream, it might feel like this is pushing the envelope. But I guess they've got a clear signal that the floor's coming up, and this is when it's going to happen. This is when you need to be at this level. So we've talked a little bit about that before, that it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, and we in this community have an obligation to show policymakers that this is achievable. And that's the part that we can play. So I don't want people who are not in New York, not in Vancouver, to say, oh, that's all right for them. I want us to start doing these projects so that we can then show our mayors and our policymakers and our councils, whoever they are, our politicians, to say, look, we can do this. It's not that hard. And if you make these changes now, the industry will come along for the ride. And will all be good. So that's the part that we as professionals can play. We shouldn't wait for our equivalent of Law 97. We should put in place all the evidence that it's achievable.
Yeah, this resonates with an interview that the most recent interview on the Outrage and Optimism podcast with Christina Figueres. It's a great climate related podcast, and they had on Bertrand Piccard, who is the guy who flew the solar plane around the world recently. He's done a bunch of other crazy adventure stuff, and it's all about proving that this transition to a better clean energy future is doable and profitable, essentially. And he talked about exactly that idea that when you can show that a solution like Passive House is practical and affordable and profitable, then you can you're more likely to be successful in moving policy, and you're more likely to be able to persuade governmental bodies to require things like Passive House. And there's again, there's that example. It allows politicians to take that step and it feels less risky to say, you got to do this. And by the way, it'll end up making you money in the future. It's okay. You'll be fine. We need to do it. So we're going to do it.
Yeah.
Bertrand Piccard is talking about 1,000. He's building this library of 1,000 examples, and then he's going to go around to all these world leaders and say, here are the examples of the interventions that are important for the climate, that are profitable, and that you need to, this is a toolbox. And why don't you just make all of these mandatory, or a bunch of them mandatory? So it's
awesome.
You're onto something, is what I'm saying.
Well, we can all do our part to reduce the number of records that we keep breaking, which are not the type of records that we want to keep breaking, and stop having those super high CO2 levels creeping up. We should only be having to worry about CO2 levels inside our buildings, not the ones outside of them.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, let's wrap that up for this week. We've got a couple more really great policy interviews. Which, by the way, Zach, I don't think they're that wonky. I think.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah, I've become self-conscious about my passion for policy. So
no, I think we're making a good case as to why architects and engineers can also have fun with policy. What do we got coming up?
And by the way, architects and engineers can be really powerful voices in policy advocacy, right? Because they're from industry.
Well, aren't we going to talk about that at the summit?
Yes, we will. Okay. All right. So coming up this week, we've got on Tuesday in North America and Wednesday in New Zealand and Australia, we have, and Tuesday in Europe, I will say, and many other places, Africa and many other places in the world. We will have the Construction Tech program, Passive House Accelerator Construction Tech, and we'll have Bob Kelly of Wickwright coming to speak about Chicago's condensation crisis. I think it'll be very dramatic, and I'm looking forward to this episode. So please join us on Tuesday. And then on the Global Passive House Happy Hour the next day, we'll have Ryan Lobello and Luis Cole from Handle Architects talking about a really incredible project called Sendero Verde, which is this huge affordable housing passive house project in New York. So that's going to be really great. Handle Architects is, of course, the firm behind many of the largest passive house buildings in North America. And then the Passive House Policy Summit is April 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time and 4 p.m. Pacific Time. And it will be focused on new construction for this summit. We'll be doing a retrofit summit in the fall. And it's looking at the three-legged stool of a successful passive house policy. So raising the floor with code, setting a cap with things like Local Law 97, and providing incentives through subsidies and incentive programs. And it starts with the resolution that we summit organizers have made, which is that every new building should be a passive house today. Virtually every building. There are probably some exceptions with some industrial uses. And that we've got policy solutions right now at our fingertips that can make that happen. So we're going to be sharing examples of those and providing people with tools that they can bring to their own communities as well. In addition to all that stuff, lots of great programming going on by other organizations. So FIAS has its Mechanical Summit from April 19th through 22nd. The Living Future Institute is holding its Living Future 2021 conference focused on inclusion and unity from April 20th through the 23rd. And then, of course, you can look forward to NAPHN's Passive House for All conference on June 10th through 11th. Got a bunch of other stuff that I will share in show notes.
Oh, and can I do a quick shout out as well for the if you're in Australia and you're looking to do passive house training, then there are scholarships available for that, which will be closing soon. So get your application in for if you want to get a scholarship to do become a passive house certified designer or tradesperson.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Zach. We'll catch you again next week on Passive House Podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Be well.